Welcome to the deep dive, where we try to cut through some of the noise and get straight to the insights.
It's definitely noisy out there.
It really is. In today's world, we are just constantly bombarded with information, aren't we? And it feels like it's getting harder and harder to figure out, what's real, what actually matters, and maybe what's subtly trying to sway your opinions.
Or maybe not so subtly sometimes. It can feel, overwhelming. Information overload is a good term for it.
Right. And that sheer volume, it makes discernment, just figuring things out, a real challenge.
It does. And as we explore the source today, we'll see that just consuming information, it isn't really enough. We kind of need a framework, maybe, to understand how it's presented and maybe more importantly, why.
Exactly. And that really is our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into a really powerful and frankly, quite thought-provoking piece of writing. It's from Peter Duke, who's a journalist and researcher, runs the Duke Report.
Ah, yes, the Substack post.
That's the one. It's titled The Leading Indicators of EpiWar. And it's not just another article, is it? It feels more like a meticulously crafted framework for understanding how narratives, how knowledge itself can become weaponized in a very different kind of conflict.
Right. And in this deep dive, we'll be unpacking Duke's provocative claim that epistemological warfare, or EpiWar as he calls it, is this invisible force. He suggests it's not just shaping history, but maybe our very perception of reality.
Which is a huge claim.
It's massive. And our goal, sort of following Duke's framework here, is to maybe equip you, the listener, with some tools to spot these hidden manipulations he talked about, helping you become more discerning, maybe better informed, and ultimately more sovereign in your own thoughts.
Duke really sets a philosophical stage right away, doesn't he? He opens with that quote from Parmenides, the ancient Greek philosopher.
Oh, the one about truth.
Yeah, the path that leads to what is, and how it is necessary for it to be, toward this. There is great persuasion. That path indeed exists, for truth persuades. That really frames the whole discussion about seeking and recognizing truth, I think.
It really does. Parmenides' ancient wisdom, it sort of grounds Duke's very modern analysis right from the start. It suggests there's this inherent persuasiveness to truth itself, if only we're willing to follow the path to find it.
But Duke argues that path can be, intentionally obscured, right, by powerful forces.
Exactly. That's at the crux of his argument.
So what does Duke mean by this will to look for it? He emphasizes that his investigations, his whole method, is based on what he calls metadata, information that's, quote, self-evident, often hidden in plain sight.
Right. And recognizing it, he says, requires no more effort than the will to look for it. That concept, metadata, it's absolutely key to understanding everything he unpacks in this report.
So metadata isn't like secret codes, it's different.
Yeah, it's crucial to his methodology. He defines metadata as information that, just by its existence and how it's presented, tells a story beyond its surface content. It's not about digging for secret files, necessarily. It's more about observing what's openly displayed and asking why. Why is it displayed that way? What agenda might it serve?
So it's about perception.
Yeah.
A deliberate act of perception.
Precisely. Moving beyond just passive consumption to active inquiry, looking at the frame, not just the picture, setting the stage, metadata, and the foundation case study.
Okay, let's unpack this then. If we're supposed to be looking for these leading indicators of hidden information and manipulation, and Duke says they're self-evident, how does he suggest we actually begin to spot them? Where do we start?
Well, what's fascinating here is that Duke provides a very practical starting point. He draws inspiration from Apple Plus's reinterpretation of Isaac Asimov's classic science fiction story, Foundation.
Ah, the TV show versus the books.
Exactly. He uses this as a kind of thought experiment in metadata analysis. Both the original book and the Apple Plus TV series, they exist. They're tangible entities, right? We don't need more proof they exist. And comparing them, he argues, offers this window into potential underlying agendas.
Okay, so if Duke suggests the show's backers, the people funding the production had some kind of agenda, maybe a punch list of concepts they needed to sell to the audience, how could we, as viewers, figure that agenda out just by looking at the show itself? Is that possible?
Duke argues you can. You determine it by comparing the original book with the TV series. You focus on the differences, the additions, the subtle shifts, even the omissions.
Okay, so what's the baseline? What was Asimov's original story about, broadly?
Well, in Asimov's original story, it was generally assumed the Galactic Empire represented, the peak of civilization. Without its centralized power, the fear was that civilization would just spin into a dark age. Specifically a dark age without an empire. And history, in Asimov's famous concept of psychohistory, was shaped by mass behavior. Individuals were largely insignificant, mostly pawns of larger forces, except for, rare anomalies like the mule. The original also included these telepathic and mind-controlling mentalics.
Okay, so that's Asimov. Now, how does Duke describe the Apple Plus series additions and transformations? What new elements did it introduce or change significantly?
Well, Duke points out several major shifts. For instance, the Apple Plus series introduces this whole genetically cloned dynasty of
The
emperors.
Cleons, right.
Exactly. And clone emperors who deviate from their expected behavior, they get erased or replaced. Their memories are wiped or rewritten by other clones who are fed programmed, edited memories.
Wow, memory wiping.
Big theme. He also highlights how genders, sexual preferences, roles of main characters are transformed to fit woke multiculturalism, as he puts it. He gives the example of an openly gay, rebellious general with a boy-toy husband. Duke even notes the source's footnote emphasizes the repeated use of the word husband, highlighting that specific framing.
Interesting detail.
What else? The series also includes emotional and physical relationships with robots. But according to Duke, the really big new idea that just jumps out is this managing and erasing of people's memories.
That theme again.
Yes. And this memory erasure trope, he notes, actually recurs as a core concept in another Apple Plus TV series, Severance.
Okay, so if Duke's analysis is correct, this memory control thing seems to be a recurring narrative obsession maybe for Apple Plus, right?
That's what Duke highlights, yeah. In Foundation, he points out that courtesans, prostitutes, rebels, dissidents, they all undergo these mental resets. Entire cultures, he notes, suffer from manipulated or erased historical memory.
That's quite dark.
It gets darker. In one particularly chilling episode he mentions, a captured assassin has her entire existence, including her entire bloodline, friends, and acquaintances, erased from the galaxy. Just gone.
That sounds like a really profound shift from Asimov. And Duke calls this a hermeneutic substitution. What does he mean by that term? What are the implications for us trying to understand this metadata?
Right, hermeneutic substitution. Duke explains that this whole system of memory control and enforced amnesia, it's completely foreign to Asimov's original framework.
It wasn't there at all.
Not like this. He suggests it indicates a fundamental shift in the adaptation itself. Moving from Asimov's societal modeling, which focused on how societies function through mass behavior, psychohistory, to Apple plus Mod's focus on cognitive intervention, where memory management becomes a direct tool of the empire.
So it's about controlling the individual mind, not just predicting the masses.
That's the implication Duke draws. It suggests that internal identity is malleable, changeable by external forces, designed to overwrite ideation and thinking, essentially controlling not just what people know, but maybe even who they believe they are.
And Duke also observes that the series takes the hero, Gal Dornick, in a vastly different direction than the books. He says she even ends up, quote, architecting a genocide that makes recent terrestrial events look like child's play, causing billions of deaths and reshaping history. That's a huge departure.
Duke argues this transformation is highly significant. Remember, Asimov insisted history is shaped by mass behavior. Individuals are largely insignificant. But the Apple series transforms Gal into this decisive agent whose actions cause massive death and reshape history.
So individuals matter, but maybe in a destructive way.
That's what Duke points out. It highlights a narrative where individual agency, maybe when controlled or directed by certain forces, can have destructive power on an unprecedented scale. It moves away from Asimov's deterministic psychohistory towards something else entirely.
So this whole thought experiment with Foundation, according to Duke, offers a powerful framework for inquiry, for recognizing how the self-evident presentation of media and ideas that surround us might reveal how we're being manipulated, how we might become, as he puts it, victims of epistemological warfare.
Exactly. It's about more than just whether you like the show or not. It's about understanding the underlying messages possibly being conveyed.
It's a lens, isn't it?
Precisely. Duke suggests the comparison between source material and its adaptation, especially when funded by powerful entities like Apple, becomes a lens. It allows us to ask, what new ideas are being seeded here? What traditional concepts are being altered or maybe even discarded? Why these specific changes? This inquiry, Duke suggests, is the first step in recognizing the dynamics of EpiWar, defining epistemological warfare, EpiWar.
Okay, so this Foundation example helps us begin to grasp what Peter Duke calls EpiWar. But what exactly is this concept in his view? Why does he consider it so crucial for us to understand?
Duke defines EpiWar pretty starkly as the invisible force behind history. That's quite a statement. He suggests that by using pattern analysis, it's possible to see its influence in, well, almost every major conflict over the last 2,000 years.
Oh,
Yeah, serving, in his view, as both the cause and explanation for mass murder on a civilizational scale. So in Duke's framework, it's this ongoing, often subtle conflict for the control of knowledge itself, how we know what we know.
and who or what, does Duke suggest, is waging this war on knowledge? Is he pointing fingers at a specific group?
He posits that a globalist crown oligarch cryptocracy controls the record of who wins battles and creates the list of events and causes called history.
Okay, cryptocracy, that sounds hidden.
It means rule by secrecy, essentially. A hidden, powerful elite influencing things from behind the scenes. In Duke's view, choices are deliberately made by these people in power about how we will come to know what we will know. He describes it as a deliberate, orchestrated effort to shape our collective understanding.
And a striking observation Duke makes is the profound impact of this control. He says it's not just about winning arguments, it's literally about life and death.
That's a really powerful point Duke makes, yeah. He warns that, depending on how we handle this information, the decisions made by those affected by the knowledge can lead to the deaths of millions of people. Millions. He introduces a specific term for the results of this process, epistemicide, defined as the mass death resulting from misunderstandings deliberately created by those who control knowledge.
Epistemicide.
Whoa.
That's chilling. The idea that engineered ignorance can be fatal on a massive scale.
That's a very chilling concept, absolutely.
So what does this all mean for how we understand conflict? Duke argues that wars, revolutions, inquisitions, and purges begin and end in language. How does language fit in?
Yes, in Duke's view, language is absolutely critical, foundational even. He explains that vocabulary and definitions are actively used to reshape people's perception of reality, which is then focused and refocused.
Like aiming a weapon.
Almost. This process, he suggests, aims to capture and control people's capacity to resist before weapons can be drawn. So by controlling the language, they control the narrative, and by controlling the narrative, they control the potential response, or lack thereof.
He gives a very stark example of this, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Encouraging us to think about the word Holocaust as a, quote, weaponized word.
He does. Duke suggests a meta-analysis of the word Holocaust is instructive here. He controversially argues that even if you accept the popular perceptions of its scale, the reported 6 million deaths pales by magnitudes beside those produced through epistemicide across centuries, which he suggests could be as high as 600 million.
That's a staggering and very controversial comparison.
Extremely. And he digs into the word itself. He notes it's drawn from Greek roots, imoro and erpire, that signify a burnt offering to God, or the gods.
So not a neutral term for genocide at all.
Not according to Duke's analysis of the etymology. This raises the important question he poses. Who decided that this specific term, with its sacrificial connotations, should be affixed to ethnocentric genocide?
Yeah, what does it mean when mass murder is framed as a ritual sacrifice? That's Duke's question, right?
Exactly. And critically, he asks, what is the presupposition or expected behavior and understanding of a mass population subjected to the definition? He argues the framing of a word can powerfully shape public understanding, emotional response, guiding it towards specific interpretations and maybe away from others. The multiple meanings, the history of the word, he notes, are metadata in themselves, potentially indicating manipulation.
Duke actually describes this as word magic, where squishy meanings become vectors for mind control. That sounds almost fantastical, but he presents it as a real-world phenomenon.
He does. He argues that when words have multiple, unclear, or contested meanings, they become potent tools for manipulation. Language, he says, is a primary vector for those who wield this word magic.
And how does he define word magic?
He defines it as the process of wrapping self-evident truth in a mystery by assigning hidden or specific definitions, while those who hear the words assume or presuppose another meaning or belief. It's this gap, Duke argues, between the intended meaning by the wielder of power and the assumed meaning by the recipient, where the manipulation occurs.
And he gives specific examples, like the word peace.
Right. He points out how terms like peace are often used by oligarchs, politicians, pundits, to mean something more like the absence of opposition to their power, not necessarily genuine harmony. He says the same gap between speech and reception is evident in really common loaded terms like freedom, liberty, liberal, conservative, hope, change, or progress.
These aren't just semantic debates for him, though. He says controlling these
This
gaps.
determines who lives and who dies. He states that explicitly. Controlling these gaps determines who lives and who dies, and adds, this is not hyperbole. In his framework, it's about the fundamental control over how entire populations understand their world and, consequently, how they react or choose not to react to perceived threats, changes, or even calls to action. Leading indicator 1, public narratives amplified by power, not truth.
Okay, so Peter Duke proposes several of these leading indicators of epistemological warfare. Let's dive into the first one he lays out. His claim that public narratives are amplified by how well they serve power, not truth. This really challenges our basic assumptions about the stories we tell ourselves, about our society, our history.
It really does. And what's fascinating here is Duke's assertion that many of the popular stories, the cultural narratives societies use to educate their populations about themselves, often turn out to be, well, fairy tales, as he puts it.
Fairy tales, not just, simplified history.
He goes further. He claims they function as mass mind control mechanisms. In his view, these aren't just quaint stories we tell children. They are actively shaping our understanding and, crucially, our obedience.
So in Duke's view, a narrative's survival, its spread through society, isn't actually dependent on its factual accuracy or its historical truth. That's a pretty radical thought for many of us who assume history is, well, objective history.
Precisely. That's his core argument for this indicator. Duke argues that a narrative survives and spreads when it advances the interests of those who hold power. Truth does not decide how long it lasts.
So truth is secondary.
Secondary to utility for power, in this view. He suggests that stories are dynamic, they change over time to fit the exigencies of the ruling power structure. This implies that what we often consider settled history could actually be a continuously evolving fabrication designed for control.
He even compares it to religion, doesn't he?
He does. He states that popular history, in this view, isn't really that different from religion. It creates belief through faith, as populations defer to expert journalists, political officials, bureaucrats, historians, in ways he argues are little different than religious adherents listening to clergy in the past.
And he connects this to.
He implies this contributes to what he controversially calls the deliberate dumbing down of America, a reliance on authority over critical thinking.
Duke suggests this makes Orwell's 1984 feel less like fiction and more like a manual, almost. The idea of continuously rewritten history serving the current power structure.
Indeed. Duke contends that modern narratives function much like divine or imperial mandates of the past to ensure obedience. He argues that power players actively commission histories, fund and direct media, and manage archives to preserve the appearance of legitimacy.
So it's an ongoing process, not something that just happened once.
Absolutely. A continuous, active process of narrative control, ensuring that only narratives that strengthen the ruling class endure. He uses this striking metaphor, calling it the poisoned loving cup. Narratives that achieve public prominence have already passed a test. They must strengthen the power of those who are actually in control.
And if they fail that test?
Narratives that fail this test, he claims, are destined to vanish no matter how true they are. He highlights this as the functional nature of what we typically call propaganda, operating within this EpiWar framework.
He provides a pretty compelling list of major historical events whose standard origin stories may, in his view, serve power rather than historical truth. What are some of those examples at questions?
Duke gives us a lot to consider here, questioning really widely accepted narratives. He cites things like civil wars, specifically the British and American ones, revolutions, the American, the French, the Russian. He even provocatively questions the very origins of central banking institutions like the Federal Reserve Bank and the Bank of International Settlements, which he refers to pointedly as the Tower of Basel.
He goes into the World Wars, too.
Yes, he challenges the established accounts of how and who started WWI and WWII, and even questions who financed and promoted major historical figures like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Hitler, and the Roosevelts. He's really questioning foundational narratives of the 20th century.
So if you're looking at a particular narrative, maybe one in the news today or one from history, how can we measure its utility to those in power, as Duke describes it? How do we determine if it might be part of this EpiWar?
Duke offers 3 pretty direct questions for assessing a narrative's utility to the powerful. First, does it paralyze opposition? Second, does it present a ready-made solution to an urgent problem? And third, does it provide cover for what is actually happening?
Paralyze? Solve? Cover.
Exactly. If the answer to these questions is yes, Duke suggests, then the narrative endures, it gets amplified. If the answer is no, it tends to disappear or get marginalized. This, in his analysis, is how propaganda functions within EpiWar, ensuring the continued dominance of the ruling powers by shaping the stories we live by. Leading indicator 2, transmedia fear and saturation.
Okay, now for the second indicator Duke discusses. And this one is really powerful, I think, and deeply challenges our common sense. The more media attention and production value a fear-based story has, the more likely it is to be false. That seems to fly directly in the face of what many of us assume about credibility.
It really does. We often think widespread attention, big budgets, Hollywood productions, that means it must be important and probably true. Duke flips that assumption.
So what's behind this? He talks about transmedia storytelling. What is that?
Right. What's fascinating here is Duke's concept of transmedia storytelling. This, he notes, is a seldom discussed discipline, but it involves deliberately propagating memes, ideas, narrative across multiple media platforms simultaneously.
So it's not just organic spread.
He emphasizes that seemingly ubiquitous ideas often aren't just organic, they are actively disseminated to the public through various channels, planned dissemination. And he says by going meta, or chunking up, as he puts it basically, stepping back and looking at the bigger pattern, it's possible to recognize these types of programs, these orchestrated campaigns.
And he connects this directly to fear. He called it transmedia fear.
Yes. Duke argues quite strongly that transmedia fear is the most efficient instrument for shaping mass behavior. It's a powerful emotional lever. And one of the simplest ways to execute this strategy, he claims, is to instill fear in people of something transcendent or unknowable, something big, scary, and hard to grasp.
Okay, and what about the mechanism of control for this kind of fear? How does it actually work in practice, according to Duke's model?
Well, Duke describes mass media, which he consistently argues is controlled by a cryptocratic oligarchy, as cultivating this fear for dual purposes, both for profit and for mind control.
Profit and control.
Both. Its explicit purpose, in his framework, is to saturate consciousness with engineered narratives that induce compliance. And the method follows a recognizable pattern. A fear-based story doesn't just pop up in one place. He argues it appears simultaneously across multiple cultural vectors, meaning it shows up in news reports, government pronouncements, blockbuster films, prestige television series, best-selling novels, video games, even popular music. It's everywhere at once.
So here's the counterintuitive part again. If a story is everywhere, doesn't that make it more credible in the minds of the public? Isn't that usually how we judge importance and validity? More sources equals more truth, right?
That's the crucial question Duke tackles head on. And he contends the opposite. He says very clearly that the ubiquity of these stories and the saturation itself indicates orchestration.
Saturation equals orchestration.
That's his point. While one might naturally assume more vectors equal more credibility, he argues that in practice, with these large-scale fear narratives, saturation itself indicates orchestration. When every medium is reinforcing the same fear, the same message, he suggests, the story functions as mind control.
Wow.
And by going meta, stepping back to see the repetition, he says, we can see these repetitive patterns. He even controversially posits whether popular culture itself is just a euphemism for mind control, given its saturation and use as a tool of psychological conditioning for, he claims, over a century.
Okay, Duke provides extensive examples of how he sees this transmedia fear operating across different domains. Let's start with terrorism. He suggests we look for a cui bono principle, who benefits.
Right. Duke uses this provocative analogy of a glass store owner who hires kids to break windows to increase business, to explain how he sees terrorism functioning. He says, terrorism is the same idea, only real people get killed.
That's a stark comparison.
It is. And the metadata to look for in most terror attacks, he says, isn't necessarily the event itself, but what politicians and leaders are calling for right after the attack, asking cui bono, who benefits from the proposed solution or the shift in policy.
He gives examples.
Yes, he points to the Patriot Act emerging swiftly after 9/11, or calls for gun control or repealing the Second Amendment immediately following school shootings as examples of looking at the proposed response to understand the potential benefit. He also notes, controversially, that the evildoers are often portrayed as lone nuts or linked to fringe groups that almost always have some bizarre connection to intelligence agencies like the CIA or law enforcement such as the FBI. He adds they are also frequently tangentially involved with SSRIs and other suspicious psychological activities. These are recurring patterns he suggests looking for.
And this isn't a new phenomenon in culture, is it? Duke highlights how the narrative of terrorism has saturated popular culture for a very long time.
Absolutely. He traces it back centuries. From 19th century literature like Dostoevsky's Demons about Russian nihilist plots, or Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday dealing with anarchist plots. Then later, you get the Cold War thrillers, Le Carré's The Little Drummer Girl, Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal, and then into modern authors like Tom Clancy, The Sum of All Fears, Executive Orders, DeLillo's work too.
And movies, of course.
Oh, absolutely central. He mentions landmark films like The Battle of Algiers, Costa Gavras' Z looking at state terrorism, the Day of the Jackal film adaptation, Black Sunday, The Dogs of War. By the 80s and 90s, terrorists become the default Hollywood villains in huge blockbusters like Die Hard, True Lies, Air Force One, Patriot Games.
And post 9/11.
The narrative gets reinforced with historical gravitas, he argues, in films like Spielberg's Munich and direct reenactments or interpretations of 9/11 myths in United 93 and Zero Dark 30. Then you have films like Captain Phillips, Hotel Mumbai, even satire, he notes, like Terry Gilliam's Brazil, where the protagonist's helper is branded a terrorist just for fixing heating ducts, or V for Vendetta, Four Lions, Team America, World Police. He even links Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove as operating on the same logic of catastrophic terror as absurdist conditioning.
Television played a huge role, too.
Immense, from the 1960s Mission, impossible with its weekly saboteur plots, to shows exploring paranoia like The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and later The X-Files focusing on conspiratorial terror. And then post 9/11, you get the explosion of shows like 24, which he says established the counterterrorism cliché Homeland, Britain's Spooks, MI5, The State Within, plus prestige miniseries like The Looming Tower and Bodyguard.
And more recently, he points to cyber warfare and psychological manipulation themes.
Right. In the 21st century, he highlights Sam Esmail's Mr. Robot, where an anarchist hacker collective, a Nephilim society, is treated as terrorist, blurring the lines between cyber resistance and terror discourse. And Esmail's other show, Homecoming, where a supposed terrorist threat justifies a covert corporate military program experimenting on veterans. With Esmail, Duke notes, terrorism mutates into something ambient and invisible, maybe cyber intrusion or trauma experiments. But the narrative function, he argues, remains the same. Terrorism as the frame that sustains paranoia, secrecy, and control.
Okay, so beyond terrorism, Duke identifies another powerful transmedia fear campaign: climate change. He mentions narrative reports and assessments that project environmental collapse and demand global management.
Yes, and he specifically points to Al Gore's 2006 film An Inconvenient Truth, which he controversially labels a fear porn film. He notes it was co-produced with Lawrence Bender, known for collaborating with Quentin Tarantino. Duke adds that both Gore and Bender are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, which the source footnote describes as a cryptocratic organization, highlighting, in Duke's view, the powerful networks involved in promoting this narrative.
And Duke details several claims from that film that he argues are misleading or exaggerated. What are some of those?
He lists several. For instance, Duke argues that Gore pointed to shrinking ice caps on Mount Kilimanjaro, but glaciologists largely attribute that to sublimation, reduced snowfall, and local factors, not just warming alone. He suggests Gore implied that the melting of Greenland or West Antarctica could raise sea levels by 7 meters soon, which Duke notes climate scientists say would actually take millennia if it happened at all.
What else?
The film suggested residents of low-lying Pacific atolls were being forced to evacuate due to rising seas. But Duke states no such mass evacuations had occurred at that time. Gore warned global warming might shut down the Gulf Stream, but Duke says climate scientists consider a complete shutdown extremely unlikely. Only a potential slowdown is plausible.
And the graphs.
Yes, the graphs. Gore showed long-term graphs of carbon dioxide and temperature with what Duke calls an exact fit, implying direct, immediate causation. Duke argues the data reveals correlation, but not the precise, immediate causal link implied in the presentation. Finally, Lake Chad's dramatic shrinkage was portrayed primarily as climate-driven, but Duke notes that factors like overgrazing, large-scale irrigation projects, and natural climate variability are considered stronger drivers by many experts. He also mentions a study about drowned polar bears used to imply climate change impact, but notes the study actually described 4 drownings resulting from a severe storm without directly attributing it solely to long-term warming.
So in Duke's analysis, the factual accuracy was secondary to the narrative's impact.
That's exactly his point regarding the metadata. Duke states, the film successfully drew attention to the imaginary dangers of climate change. That's the metadata. Its raison d'etre, its telos, why it was made. The facts are secondary to the narrative. He urges the reader and us to ask why it is so important for this false narrative to be sold to the public.
And he points out that controversy around climate science didn't stop the narrative.
No. He mentions the ClimateGate emails controversy, which he says revealed manipulations that discredited the scientific pretext for many, yet the fear persisted in the public sphere. He also references Michael Crichton's novel State of Fear. Crichton also wrote Jurassic Park and Andromeda Strain, which directly challenged the climate change narrative, portraying how climate alarmism, in Duke's interpretation of Crichton's work, operates as a political weapon.
It really does make you wonder about things we see every day, like weather forecasts. If Duke's claims about potential data manipulation hold any water, is the modeling just inherently difficult, or could there be other explanations for forecasts that seem consistently off? It reminds me of that Steve Martin movie LA Story, where his character just makes up funny forecasts because the real ones are so unreliable.
It raises questions, certainly, and Duke's analysis of the shifting phases of climate fear is particularly insightful here. He argues it didn't just arrive fully formed, but moved through successive waves of public concern, each promoted through media.
Like global cooling first.
Exactly. He notes that during the 1960s and 70s, major magazines like Time and Newsweek ran covers warning of a coming ice age. This influenced novels like J.G. Ballard's The Drought and films like Robert Altman's Quintet. Documentaries like Dimming the Sun dramatized fears about pollution and aerosols causing cooling.
Then it flipped to warming.
Right. By the late 80s and 90s, he says, the focus shifted dramatically to global warming, driven by rising cohort levels. This generated works like Kim Stanley Robinson's 40 Signs of Rain, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, and Robinson's later New York 2140. And of course, Hollywood got involved with big spectacles like Waterworld in 1995 and The Day After Tomorrow in 2004.
And I definitely remember the ozone hole panic from the late 80s. That was everywhere.
Duke points that out, too. The ozone hole became a major cultural fixation. There was children's programming about skin cancer, UV danger, even sci-fi tie-ins like Captain Planet villains related to ozone depletion. While that specific panic eventually faded, Duke suggests its cultural mark lingered. Humanity had saved the planet once, priming audiences to accept future eco-catastrophe campaigns. It created a template, perhaps.
And then it all consolidated under climate change.
Yes, by the 2000s, Duke notes, the terminology solidified around climate change, a more encompassing, maybe less falsifiable term. Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in 2006 became the flagship moment, followed by things like An Inconvenient Sequel in 2017, Leonardo DiCaprio's Before the Flood in 2016, and numerous eco-documentaries and series on HBO and Netflix, TV series like Apple TV Plus Extrapolations in 2023, or James Cameron's Years of Living Dangerously in 2014 continued the theme.
So it's a cycle of panic, according to Duke.
He argues these shifting phases, cooling, warming, ozone depletion, now climate change, are presented relentlessly through novels, films, TV, magazines, documentaries, creating what he calls a cyclical cycle of eco-panic. Each phase saturates the media, then maybe fades slightly or morphs into the next, but the central theme, he argues, never diminishes. The planet is perpetually in crisis, and the audience is perpetually in need of guidance from experts, governments, or corporations. He even cites South Park's recurring man-bear-pig character as a sharp satire on this very theme, showing how deeply ingrained the cycle of eco-alarmism has become in culture.
Then there's nuclear annihilation, another constant source of transmedia fear, Duke argues.
Yes, another big one. Duke notes how thinkers like Herman Kahn, with his book on thermonuclear war, kind of institutionalized nuclear dread in policy circles, while Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove famously mocked the logic of deterrence, perhaps making the fear more accessible, more thinkable, in a strange way. He even mentions a contrarian view from Michael Palmer's Hiroshima Revisited, which controversially claimed the bombs used weren't actually nuclear.
But why keep promoting the fear?
That's the deeper question Duke raises within his framework. Why invest so much cultural energy, so many resources in promoting the nuclear annihilation narrative for decades? He suggests the sheer scope and intensity of the campaign indicates that the fear itself, the conditioning, might be the strategic objective, regardless of the objective likelihood of the event. He references trailers for Dr. Strangelove and the documentary The Atomic Cafe as examples of this cultural saturation.
And moving right along the fear spectrum, disease and pandemics have, according to Duke, haunted popular culture for well over a century.
Indeed. He argues this isn't new at all. Duke points to early literary examples, like H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, where the invading Martians are ultimately defeated by Earth's microbes. Or Edgar Allan Poe's classic The Masque of the Red Death, Mary Shelley's The Last Man. These early works, he suggests, embedded contagion as this powerful, recurring narrative engine in Western culture.
And it continued strongly in the 20th century.
Absolutely. He mentions 20th century fiction like Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which shifted vampirism towards a plague narrative and has been adapted repeatedly. Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, the extraterrestrial virus, the lab accident trope, Stephen King's massive novel The Stand with its weaponized superflu. He also includes nonfiction works like Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague, which he says made the idea of plandemic's everyday suspense, effectively blurring the lines between potential reality and thriller narratives.
And Duke argues Hollywood, it seems, has been rehearsing these pandemic scenarios for decades.
That's exactly his framing, Hollywood rehearsals. He claims films have continuously drilled these narratives into the public consciousness, from early examples like Panic in the Streets in 1950 or The Cassandra Crossing in 1976, where the U.S. military contemplates killing infected passengers, to Wolfgang Petersen's big-budget outbreak in 1995, Danny Boyle's influential 28 Days Later, Mark Forster's World War Z.
But he singles out one film in particular.
Yes. Crucially, Duke points to Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion as providing the most clinical rehearsal. He argues it mapped out quarantine procedures, mask mandates, rapid vaccine development, even societal breakdown and misinformation campaigns, calling it an exact prescript for COVID-19.
Television serialized this dread, too, right?
Absolutely. He mentions the BBC series Survivors from 1975 and its 2008 remake. The X-Files frequently featured viral outbreaks linked to secret government programs, and then massively popular shows like The Walking Dead or others like Helix, The Hot Zone. Duke even specifically mentions an episode of the Dead Zone TV series called Plague, written by Stephen King, as being, quote, so on the nose for COVID-19 hysteria.
Video games got in on it, too.
Big time. Capcom's huge Resident Evil franchise, Valve's Half-Life series, Naughty Dog's The Last of Us, even simulation games like Plague Inc., where you design the pandemic. Comics and anime, too. He mentions Japanese creators responding to Hiroshi Nagasaki's fears through pandemic allegories like Akira, and Western comics like Marvel's X-Men with the Legacy Virus storyline.
What about nonfiction and real-world drills?
He points to documentary and nonfiction like Richard Preston's The Hot Zone book, Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague, and constant specials on the next pandemic. He also notes how public health drills and even school lessons rehearsed quarantine measures and mask wearing, echoing, he says, the old duck and cover drills for nuclear annihilation, preparing the mindset.
Even satire played a role.
Yes. He notes that satire like Shaun of the Dead, Zombieland, or South Park's take on swine flu showed the pandemic tropes were so deeply ingrained in the culture that they could be inverted for comedy. Yet, he argues, the underlying themes of masks, panic buying, social collapse, and government control remained potent and recognizable.
Okay, let's not forget aliens and extraterrestrials, a huge genre. Duke argues this narrative also serves as a vector for transmedia fear, or at least conditioning.
Right. Duke traces an extensive literary lineage for this one. Back to Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Samuel Butler, Erewhon, and of course H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, The First Men in the Moon. Then C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom, Mars, and Pellucidar, Inner Earth series.
And the golden age of sci-fi.
Absolutely crucial. He lists giants like Robert A. Heinlein, The Puppet Masters, Stranger in a Strange Land, Isaac Asimov, The Gods Themselves, Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End, 2001, Rendezvous with Rama, Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles, Kurt Vonnegut, Sirens of Titan, Slaughterhouse-Five. Then the new wave authors like Philip K. Dick, Three Stigmata, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Ursula K. Le Guin, Left Hand of Darkness, Stanislaw Solaris, Frank Herbert, Dune. An incredible output shaping our imagination.
And this exploded onto the screen.
Massively. Starting in the 1950s with classics like The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Man from Planet X, Invaders from Mars, Forbidden Planet, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing from Another World. Then later, epoch-defining works like Star Wars, Alien, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., John Carpenter's terrifying remake of The Thing, Independence Day.
Yeah.
He also includes subterranean alien creature stories like The Mole People or The Descent.
Television was huge here, too.
Foundational. Star Trek, Doctor Who, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, Lost in Space, Battlestar Galactica, original and remake, The X-Files. Even comedy got in on the act. My Favorite Martian, Mork and Mindy, ALF, Third Rock from the Sun, making aliens familiar, perhaps less threatening, or just embedding the concept deeper.
And radio.
Can't forget Orson Welles' legendary 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, which famously caused panic for some listeners, and Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which started on radio.
So what does a metacomedy like Galaxy Quest tell us, in Duke's view, about all this epistemological warfare potentially surrounding the alien narrative?
Duke finds Galaxy Quest interesting because it inverts the usual dynamic. Instead of the premise being, we humans are making up stories about aliens, the film's premise is that actual aliens think our fictional TV shows about humans in space are real historical documents.
Right, they model their society on the show.
Exactly. And while it's presented as hilarious, Duke pushes us to ask, what is the meta-messaging going on here? He suggests it's perhaps a subtle nod to the power of constructed reality, how our own fictions can shape perceptions, maybe even be used as a tool, or perhaps hint that the line between fiction and reality is more blurred than we think.
Okay, finally in this section, transhumanism and artificial intelligence, AI. These are massive topics today, and Duke views them through this same lens of transmedia fear and potential conditioning.
Yes, he tackles these head-on. Duke argues that transhumanism is often presented as this glossy promise of transcendence through technology, enhancing human capabilities. Yet, he claims it actually conceals a program of control.
How so?
He says popular culture films like The Matrix, Ghost in the Shell, TV shows like Black Mirror, movies like Ex Machina, primes audiences to accept the merging of human and machine as both inevitable and desirable. But in Duke's view, these narratives rarely ask who directs the process or to what end. The seductive images of superhuman capability, he claims, mask the underlying dependence on hidden operators or the potential loss of autonomy.
He calls it a canard based on a Gnostic fantasy. What does he mean by that?
Right, a canard meaning a false or misleading story. And he frames it as projecting a Gnostic fantasy that humans, as they are not good enough. Gnosticism, historically, often involved esoteric knowledge and a belief that the material world is flawed or evil, and escape comes through enlightenment or transcendence. Duke believes the power structure reinforces this mindset by dangling a new version of humanity in a utopian future, training adherents to reject their own being in favor of engineered improvement. It's a critique of rejecting natural humanity.
And AI fear, Duke suggests, functions in a very similar way.
He argues it operates in parallel, yes. Cinema and literature often frame AI as either the destroyer, the Terminator, the Overlord, HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey, or even the lover, her. Each portrayal, in his view, reduces humanity to being merely a foil for technological dominance or dependence.
And the effect is similar.
He argues it conditions audiences to fear collapse or enslavement if regulation or submission is not accepted. If AI isn't controlled by the right people, or if we don't merge with it, doom awaits. He notes that tech leaders themselves often reinforce these dramatic stories, perhaps for their own purposes. AI fear, Duke claims, is also presented as a canard, projecting that same Gnostic fantasy of inadequacy, that human beings are insufficient without augmentation or control. He suggests this frame ultimately benefits the power structure, which gains compliance by holding out the promise of a safer or smarter future under machine guidance.
And Duke specifically mentions the idea of the digital twin as particularly unsettling. He frames it almost as a form of suicidal submission to control.
Yes, that's a strong claim he makes. He points to works like Neil Stephenson's novel Fall, or Dodge in Hell and the Amazon Prime series Upload, as popularizing this idea that a human mind can be replicated or uploaded into cyberspace, as if uploading pseudo-consciousness somehow preserves the soul or achieves immortality.
But he sees the danger there.
He argues this narrative invites adherents to view the body as disposable, training them to accept self-inflicted euthanasia under the guise of transcendence. Duke concludes pretty starkly that the digital twin is designed to convince populations that abandoning their mortal frame is an act of progress when it is actually a suicidal submission to control, accepting the virtual simulation over embodied reality.
Okay, so to summarize this incredibly detailed second indicator on transmedia fear, Duke suggests the key measure here is the ubiquity of fear. We should ask, how many resources over what time period has a promotion of a particular fear been sustained? How many different channels, movies, news, books, social media, games, memes, are repeating the same core tropes and narratives?
Exactly. In Duke's view, it's that sheer saturation, the coordinated presence across media that serves as the crucial metadata. It indicates to him an orchestrated effort rather than just organic public concern or artistic exploration. He challenges us, the audience, to observe this pattern, to look for the repetition and saturation as a potential sign of manipulation. Leading indicator 3. the explanation of expedient deaths.
Okay, moving on to the third leading indicator of EpiWar that Duke outlines. He turns our attention here to something quite dark. The explanation of the death of a lightning rod persona. This sounds like a truly chilling claim about how power might operate behind the scenes.
It is chilling, and what's fascinating, or perhaps disturbing, here is Duke's core assertion that the truthfulness and the reported causes surrounding the deaths of influential or controversial figures depend on how convenient the death is perceived to be for those in power.
So he's suggesting it's not necessarily about objective fact, but about strategic narrative utility, whether the death or the story of the death serves an agenda.
That's precisely his argument for this indicator. It's about narrative management through life and death, potentially.
So in Duke's framework, if it's convenient for what he calls the ruling oligarch cryptocracy, for a certain person to appear to be dead, that will happen. He's suggesting deaths could be faked.
Yes, Duke explicitly suggests that's a possibility within this framework. And conversely, if it is a requirement that the person actually die, he claims the circumstances surrounding that death may be engineered through parallel construction.
Parallel construction, what's that?
It's a term often used in intelligence or law enforcement contexts. It's a technique where evidence might be initially obtained through a hidden or perhaps questionable, maybe illegal source. Then, a separate, clean, official account of how that evidence was discovered is fabricated to make it admissible or publicly palatable. Duke applies this concept here, suggesting the official story of a death might be a constructed narrative masking engineered circumstances.
And he even suggests that faked attempts or staged assassinations can play a role in this narrative control, not just actual deaths.
Absolutely. Duke notes that faked and failed attempts such as staged assassinations can be engineered to shape public opinion and redirect suspicion. He specifically references the incident involving Donald Trump and a potential threat at a rally, referred to as the Butler event, as raising questions of staging in his view, suggesting such events might not always be what they seem on the surface, but could serve a calculated narrative purpose, creating sympathy, shifting focus, etc.
Okay, he provides an extensive list of examples here, covering a wide range of figures, political leaders, journalists, cultural icons, even historical disasters. It's really important, I think, to reiterate that these are Peter Duke's claims and interpretations within his specific EpiWar framework.
Indeed, we're reporting on his analysis here, and Duke's list is certainly comprehensive and deliberately provocative. He groups them loosely. For example, he mentions John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. under the heading of real death that benefited exactly who, posing that question. He includes JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette in that category too.
Then there are deaths under questionable circumstances.
Yes. He lists figures like Robert Maxwell, the media mogul, Michael Hastings, the journalist killed in a very unusual car crash after reportedly working on sensitive stories, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, the victims of the poisoning case in the UK, with major political overtones, Pope John Paul I, whose death after only 33 days as Pope has always been shrouded in speculation, Kary Mullis, the Nobel laureate inventor of PCR, who was critical of using PCR tests for finding viruses like HIV. Mullis died officially of pneumonia heart attack shortly before the COVID-19 outbreak.
He mentions Kobe Bryant, too.
Provocatively, yes. Duke simply states about Kobe Bryant's helicopter crash death kicked off COVID-19, suggesting a potential timing or narrative link in his view. He also lists Princess Diana, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman, Steve Jobs, fast cancer, Tracy Twyman, an occult researcher who died after reporting threats following the death of Isaac Kappy, and Isaac Kappy himself.
Then there's a category of people assumed dead, evidence unsettled, according to Duke.
Right. This includes figures like Jeffrey Epstein, where the circumstances of his death remain highly debated, Adolf Hitler, whose death is officially recorded but subject to persistent alternative theories, and Jim Morrison of The Doors, where Duke asks directly, did he OD or did he disappear, raising the possibility of fake death.
He also lists numerous, sudden, perhaps convenient deaths.
Yes, people like Andrew Breitbart, the conservative media figure who died of a sudden heart attack just before releasing potentially damaging information. He goes back historically, too, mentioning Alfred Charles William Harmsworth, Viscount Northcliffe, a powerful British press baron in the early 20th century. Duke claims Northcliffe was forcibly removed from control of his press and branded abnormal in 1922, specifically to prevent him from opposing the controversial British mandate for Palestine. More recently, Tafari Campbell, the personal chef to Barack Obama who died in a paddleboarding incident. Jeff Thomas, described as Peter Thiel's Instagram model boyfriend who died after falling from his Miami high-rise apartment.
And many cultural figures.
A long list. George Carlin, Joan Rivers, both known for controversial comedy, Michael Jackson, Prince, Kurt Cobain, John Lennon, Tom Petty, River Phoenix, Heath Ledger, Brittany Murphy, Frank Zappa, all deaths that were sudden, often involving drugs or unexpected health issues, raising questions for Duke about convenience or timing.
He even includes deaths by plane crash or major disasters, suggesting they might not be accidents.
Yes, he lists prominent political figures who died in plane crashes like Hale Boggs and Larry McDonald, both congressmen, Ron Brown, Commerce Secretary. He also includes Nelia and Naomi Biden, Joe Biden's first wife and daughter who died in a car crash. And he controversially includes major technological disasters.
Yeah.
The Apollo 1 fire, killing Grissom, White, Chaffee, the Challenger shuttle explosion, and the Columbia shuttle disintegration.
And even the Titanic.
Yes, he mentions the Titanic Olympic ship switch theory, specifically noting the prominent opponents of the Federal Reserve who died on the Titanic, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor. He also includes the sinking of the Lusitania, a key event leading to U.S. entry into WWI. He frames all these as potentially expedient deaths, serving some larger agenda.
So if we connect this indicator back to the bigger picture of EpiWar, Duke is arguing that these expedient deaths, whether they are real, fabricated, or accidental but conveniently timed, serve as powerful instruments of narrative management.
That's exactly his argument. He claims that by controlling the perception of whether a figure is dead, how they died, and what symbolic weight attaches to that event, the cryptocracy, as he calls it, molds public belief and historical memory.
So the story becomes the weapon.
Yes. He concludes that apparent assassinations create martyrs, staged deaths erase liabilities, and ambiguous cases generate endless speculation that fractures public discourse. Each variant in his analysis functions as a weapon of epistemological warfare. It ensures that public debates focus on the mystery or the official story, potentially overshadowing deeper issues, while the cryptocracy, in his view, quote, advances its strategic objectives unhindered. It's a claim that requires us to constantly question the official narrative surrounding pivotal deaths. Leading indicator 4. The Library at Alexandria is an ongoing fire.
All right, the fourth and final leading indicator Peter Duke discusses is a particularly poignant one, I think. He uses the metaphor, the Library of Alexandria is an ongoing fire. What does this powerful image convey in his framework? What's he getting at here?
It's a very evocative metaphor, isn't it? And what's fascinating here is how Duke uses it to describe what he sees as an ongoing, active process of knowledge destruction and manipulation. Not just a historical event, but something happening now.
So the fire is still burning.
That's the implication. He states quite plainly that if there's one thing he's learned in his own efforts to understand how reality gets reframed, it's this. Quote, through the dissemination of bullshit and the destruction of accurate, truthful accounts of history, humanity is cowed and herded like cattle. Strong words.
Very strong. So this isn't just about controlling the information that gets out, but also actively suppressing and erasing alternative accounts, truthful accounts, in Duke's view. Destroying knowledge, basically.
Exactly. That's the core of this indicator. He describes a vast list, his word, of thoughtful renderings of the past that have been dropped down Orwell's memory hole. These are works, perspectives, entire lines of inquiry that challenge the dominant narratives, the officially sanctioned history. They represent inconvenient truths, perhaps.
And he provides a list of authors he believes have been sidelined, or whose work has been actively suppressed or ignored by the mainstream. Who are some of the key figures Duke highlights in this context?
Duke's list is indeed expensive, and it points towards what he sees as a systemic effort to control the intellectual landscape, to keep certain ideas out of bounds. He includes some very prominent names, people like Carroll Quigley, famous for Tragedy and Hope, and he even references a 1974 interview clip with Quigley. Anthony Sutton, known for his work on Wall Street's links to Bolshevism and Nazism. Guido Preparata, James McGregor Burns, John O'Dowd, Jerry Doxerty, Iowan Rashew, Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com, James Corbett of The Corbett Report, Jay Dyer, Patrick Wood on Technocracy, Anton Sheetkin, Webster Tarpley, Eustace Mullins, Edwin Black, F. William Engdahl, Christopher Simpson, L. Fletcher Prouty, the famous Mr. X from Oliver Stone's JFK, Douglas Reed, David Talbot, E. Michael Jones, David Irving, a very controversial historian, Ray's Martin, Joan Mellon, Ellen Brown on banking, Matthew Crawford, Courtney Turner, Matthew Arrett, Cynthia Chung, Paul Kudnick, Richard Poe, and he concludes the list by saying hundreds of others.
That is a long and diverse list of researchers and writers. So how can we as listeners or readers identify these potentially important yet possibly suppressed works, according to Duke? Does he offer a clue, a tell?
He offers a very practical, almost cynical tell. Many of these books, he points out, are out of print, hard to find, expensive used copies. And crucially, he says, none of them are New York Times bestsellers.
Ah, so being a bestseller is bad.
He provocatively claims that a New York Times bestseller usually means bullshit that you should assume is propaganda the power elite wants you to consume without thinking. So, in his view, mainstream success, especially hitting that particular list, might actually be an indicator against truthfulness or critical importance, suggesting it's been approved or promoted by the system. It flips our conventional understanding of publishing success completely on its head.
And what often happens to the authors themselves, those who, in Duke's view, uncover and publish these hidden truths or challenging perspectives.
Duke notes a pattern. Many of the listed authors were celebrated, maybe early in their careers, until they crossed the invisible line of power and dared to reveal things that power did not want revealed. Once they crossed that line, he suggests, their reputations might be attacked, their access limited, their work ignored or marginalized.
Drop down the memory hole.
Exactly. Sent down Orwell's memory hole, as he puts it. This suggests, in his framework, a system that might initially tolerate or even promote certain voices up to a point. But when those voices challenge the foundational narratives or expose inconvenient truths about the ruling elite, the system clamps down and they are effectively erased from mainstream discourse.
And Duke himself is actively involved in trying to counter this ongoing fire, this suppression of knowledge.
Yes, he shares that he's personally invested in this. He says he has spent the past 5 years building a catalog of these books, a resource he calls Things You Were Never Taught in School. He's even arranged for AI robots to explain things from these books on SoundCloud, highlighting his personal commitment to making what he considers suppressed knowledge more accessible to a wider audience, using modern tools to fight the fire, so to speak.
Reclaiming our minds.
Okay, so we've walked through Duke's 4 leading indicators of EpiWar. The manipulation of public narratives for power, the saturation of culture with transmedia fear, the control over how we understand potentially expedient deaths, and this ongoing suppression or destruction of truthful histories, the ongoing fire. Given all this, what can we as individuals actually do? How do we combat this?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And the first step Duke identifies is actually recognizing one of the key weapons used against critical inquiry itself. That weapon is the label, conspiracy theorists.
The dismissal tactic.
Exactly. He notes these words have been, in his view, officially weaponized since 1963, often traced back to a CIA dispatch regarding critiques of the Warren Commission, to shut down people and the ideas that ask questions like the ones I've illustrated in this post. So just recognizing that label as a tactic, as a form of EpiWar itself, designed to dismiss and delegitimize challenging viewpoints without actually engaging with their substance, that's step one.
So Duke isn't claiming to have discovered some secret key or have all the answers himself, but rather he's aiming to provide a starting point, a framework for our own critical thinking.
Exactly right. He's very clear about this. He explicitly states, I don't claim these leading indicators are comprehensive, meaning there might be others, but they establish a framework for questioning the structures of narrative control. The power, he believes, ultimately lies not with him providing definitive answers, but with the individual's capacity to engage in rigorous, reasoned, critical inquiry.
Okay, so what is the path forward then? What's the solution or the method he proposes for navigating this incredibly complex, potentially manipulated information landscape?
Duke suggests the solution lies in actively applying logos.
Yeah.
He defines this not just as logic, but as reasoned verbal inquiry and discernment, crisis, guided by love, in the direction of truth.
Reason, discernment, love, truth, that's quite a combination.
It is. It implies not just intellectual rigor, but also a certain ethical or even spiritual orientation towards seeking what's real. This process, he argues, applying logos in crisis, helps us cultivate critical awareness. It's about moving from being passive consumers of information to active, conscious participants in understanding.
And this idea of moving to the meta level, observing the patterns, seems absolutely crucial to his approach.
Yes, that critical awareness, Duke explains, is what enables us to rise above the surface of news and examine how stories are constructed, repeated, and reinforced across different platforms. To think critically, he emphasizes, requires a movement to the meta level, where we observe how narratives frame our perception of reality.
So it's about seeing the matrix, not just the individual agents.
That's a good analogy. It's about seeing the patterns, understanding the context of presentation, recognizing the techniques being used, not just reacting to the individual pieces of information or the emotional charge they carry.
And the ultimate goal, then, in Duke's view, is really quite profound, isn't it? It's about inner freedom.
It really is. He argues that by actively practicing this discipline, this reasoned inquiry, this meta-level observation, we reclaim sovereignty over our own minds and resist the machinery of epistemological warfare.
Hmm.
It's fundamentally about empowering ourselves to think independently, to discern truth from manipulation, and ultimately to foster intellectual autonomy in a world saturated with attempts to control our perception.
Apple's metaphors of control.
Before we wrap things up, Duke actually points out even deeper layers of metadata in that initial foundation example, specifically concerning Apple TV Plus itself. He suggests there might be another layer of intentional symbolic design woven into their media. It's almost like looking for hidden languages or signals.
Yes, he delves into that. And what's fascinating here is his identification of shared symbolic ideas that he sees running between Apple TV plus Hearst Foundation and their other show, Severance. It goes beyond just similar plot points about memory.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, he highlights the recurring use of light as a symbol or name for power. In Foundation, the dominant faith is called Luminism. In Severance, the corporation the characters work for is Lumen Industries. Both names clearly draw from lumen, the Latin word for light.
Okay, so what's the significance of that, according to Duke?
He asks the question directly, what is being signaled when light is the name of power? And he connects this to some very old, very powerful archetypes in esoteric traditions.
Such a...
He points to figures like Lucifer, whose name means light bearer, often depicted as the one who offers forbidden knowledge, perhaps at the price of temptation or a fall. He mentions the historical Illuminati, who define themselves through illumination, the guarded possession of hidden light, and Freemasonry, which he says encodes the same theme in its rituals of initiation, promising revelation behind veils of secrecy.
So he's asking if Apple is deliberately tapping into that symbolism.
He poses the question, do these Apple Plus stories intentionally align their imaginary institutions, luminism, lumen, with this ancient archetype of light representing a form of power, perhaps a controlled form of knowledge, or hidden enlightenment? He also highlights potential architectural and ritual cues he sees.
Architectural cues in the shows.
Yeah, he points out that in Foundation, the Emperor's Palace is set between twin towers, which he argues echoes Boaz and Jachin, the symbolic pillars, said to stand at the entrance of Solomon's temple, and which are central symbols in Masonic ritual, representing a threshold of initiation.
And in Severance.
In Severance, he notes the protagonist, Mark, is shown sleeping on black and white tessellated bedsheets. This checkerboard pattern is famously used on the floors of Masonic lodges and represents, among other things, the interplay of opposites, a ritual ground. Seeing it transposed into such an intimate space, the bedroom, Duke finds significant.
So are these just set dressing or something more?
That's exactly the question Duke asks. Are these just decorative touches or deliberate cues that the narrative world is structured as ritual ground? Signs meant to be read by those familiar with the symbolism.
And he even looks at the symbolism in the character names.
He does. In Severance, he notes we have main characters named Mark and Peter, both obviously key apostles in the New Testament. And another crucial character is named Heli, which he suggests could be short for Helena, a name carrying connotations of Helen of Troy, or perhaps Saint Helena, associated with finding the true cross, suggesting themes of descent or quests.
So what's the implication there?
He asks, do these characters recast apostles inside a secular gospel? Are they playing out ancient roles within this modern corporate technological setting?
And then there's the Apple brand itself, the logo.
Right. Duke brings it right back to the company identity. He highlights Apple's iconic emblem, a bitten apple, which he calls a direct gesture to the fruit of knowledge in Genesis. The forbidden fruit that Eve bit, leading to expulsion from Eden, but also the knowledge of good and evil.
So what's the overall pattern Duke sees here?
He puts it all together. If light, towers, tessellation, and apostolic names all encode initiation, he asks, does the logo frame the entire enterprise as an echo of the first illumination, Eve's bite into forbidden knowledge? When the same cluster of signals recurs across stories, imagery, and logos within the same media ecosystem, Apple TV+, he suggests it raises a serious question. Is this a coincidence or a not-so-subtle hint at Luciferian illumination woven into the fabric of entertainment by design? It implies a potentially sophisticated, multi-layered level of symbolic communication embedded within popular culture, intended perhaps only for a certain audience to fully grasp. Outro.
Well, we've taken a truly deep dive today into Peter Duke's powerful and definitely challenging Substack post, The Leading Indicators of EpiWar. We've explored his claim that epistemological warfare is this invisible force shaping our world, shaping our reality.
We really have. And it's important, I think, as you said, to remember we've been exploring Duke's framework here, unpacking his specific arguments and examples, not necessarily endorsing every single conclusion, but using his ideas to really spark critical thinking about how narratives and information function.
Absolutely. We've looked at how Duke argues media narratives can be engineered to serve power, not truth. How language itself can be weaponized through word magic. The pervasive nature of what he calls transmedia fear campaigns across so many domains: terrorism, climate, disease, aliens, AI.
We also covered his disturbing analysis of expedient deaths and how the narrative surrounding them might be controlled. And finally, his metaphor of the ongoing fire at the Library of Alexandria, the constant battle, in his view, to suppress truthful histories and inconvenient knowledge.
And the core takeaway from Duke's work, really, seems to be the vital importance of applying logos in crisis, that reasoned inquiry and critical discernment, to absolutely everything we encounter, especially information presented by powerful sources.
Definitely. Vigilance and critical thinking are paramount in his view.
So thinking about everything we've discussed today, what stands out most to you from this deep dive into Duke's perspective? What's the thing that lingers?
For me, it might be that core metaphor, Peter Duke reminding us that the Library of Alexandria is an ongoing fire. It implies this isn't just an academic exercise. It's a constant, active battle for our minds, for our understanding of reality happening right now.
That leads to a final provocative thought for you, the listener. If, as Duke argues, controlling the past helps control the future, and if language and narratives control our perception of reality, what responsibility do we each have to scrutinize the stories we're told? Especially those stories presented with the highest production values, the biggest budgets, and the widest reach across multiple media platforms.
And maybe how might recognizing this potential metadata, these patterns Duke describes, the saturation, the fear, the convenient narratives, how might that change your daily engagement with media? Could it foster a more critical, maybe more empowered way of seeing the world around you? Something to think about.
We invite you to continue your own deep dive into these fascinating and, frankly, vital topics. Thank you for joining us.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.